Thank you.
All right. So good afternoon. Is the mic working? Yeah. Good. So thank you for coming here. We are going to be talking about how to secure Heroku applications. The focus of the talk is going to be from an enterprise angle, right? We want to give you different tools and strategies on how to secure the different sensitivity applications that you might have in your enterprise, and give you the option and the tools that you need to make the right decisions as to how to best use Heroku to secure those applications. So I'm Mikel. I'm a principal application security engineer at Salesforce, and this is Sergey.
Hi, I'm lead application security engineer at Salesforce. And today we're going to talk about securing Heroku apps. But before we start, there is a mandatory forward-looking statements.
Yeah, so you want to go through the legalese?
Yeah, you've probably seen them a number of times, but essentially it means that you shouldn't make purchases based on what you see in slides, but buy based on what the products are available.
Yeah, so we are a publicly traded company. Please make your buying decisions only on the products commercially available from Salesforce. We might talk about some new security features that are coming up with Heroku, but I think with this statement we are covered on that. All right, so as I said earlier, the focus of the talk is to go through the different security controls that Heroku offers to the enterprise. We are going to be talking about three big different areas, right? One of it is going to be the account security of your users in Heroku. The other one is going to be the different roles and permissions that you can assign to your users in Heroku. And then we are going to be covering the private spaces for Heroku.
So let's start with the best practices. So the first thing that we would like to tell you about is what user account security features are available. You probably have seen this a number of times, the recommendation to use two-factor authentication. And Heroku provides this awesome way to basically take any TOTP client out there, like Google Authenticator, like Salesforce Authenticator, and use it with Heroku. You can find this setting in the user account settings, so basically go to the top right, and it's super easy to enable. But why is it so important to have this?
So, just a quick show of hands. How many people here use two-factor authentication on their personal email? Interesting. It's about half of the attendees. We really want to emphasize the importance of having two-factor authentication enabled for all your users in Heroku. It protects against many different types of attacks, right? Dictionary attacks, brute force attacks. Protects you against password reuse. If one of your users is using the same password on, I don't know, Amazon or any other website, and in Heroku, and then that website gets compromised, suddenly your enterprise can get compromised as a result. So we cannot underscore enough the importance of enabling two-factor authentication in Heroku. There is a way to monitor whether or not your users are actually following policy and they have two-factor authentication enabled. And you can see here on the slide that 2FA not enabled is one of the options. So as an admin, you can go there and see who doesn't have it enabled. You can choose to kick them out of the group, or you can give them a call and ask them to set it up.
Yeah, or you can actually, you can decide to, let's say, if you have some members that have not enrolled in 2FA yet, you may want to maybe give them reduced permissions. And as soon as they have enrolled into 2FA, then you can provide maybe them more permissions and more actions that they can control and perform. But one thing that actually helps with 2FA and actually with other policies that an enterprise might have to enforce is actually single sign-on. So if you have 2FA set up, the user may choose and go back and probably, let's say, turn off 2FA. But as an enterprise, we would like to have a consistent way of all users and all policies being applied.
Yeah, so I guess the difference is that out of the box with Heroku, you can monitor who has 2FA enabled. If you really want to enforce that policy, for highly critical applications, right, or enterprise legacy systems or whatever, you can use single sign-on, and effectively you are extending your 2FA policy over to your Heroku users. And when you do that, Heroku users are what we call federated over there, and they can log in into Heroku only through the SSO door. They cannot log in through the regular Heroku login. And as a result of that, you can not only enforce 2FA, but you can enforce login IP ranges and any other policies that you have on your 2FA in the enterprise.
Right, so it's fairly easy to set up SSO in Heroku as well, so it's all in the organization level. So you create an SSO, and so every user that comes through it will be essentially required to use SSO. There's one thing that people can also use in an organization is to use OAuth to give access to third-party apps to their Heroku account. But you may think, okay, so I have configured SSO, but now there's a way for a user to actually grant access to an organization through OAuth. Luckily, Heroku security folks already thought about it, and so there's a way to turn off third-party OAuth. So if you would like to have a very tight environment where you control what people can do and cannot do in the organization in a Heroku environment, so you can turn off OAuth and you can have SSO and all of the policies enforced.
So basically this increases the isolation of your application. You don't have an app talking to a third party through a refresh token or an access token or something similar.
Right. So far we have covered user access, user account security settings. So I'd like to move on to the roles and permissions.
Right, so in Heroku terminology, right, there are different roles and terms for them. You have organizations, you have members, you have admins, you have app owners, you have collaborators, and what we are aiming to do with this slide is kind of shed some clarity as to how we would organize an enterprise Heroku usage. So at the highest level, right, you have an organization which is a pretty flat structure. It basically treats your apps as a shared collection. You can monitor the resource usage of your enterprise. You can add and remove members and users, and you can give the developers the access that they need to perform the work that they do. And I think that one recurring theme during this presentation is going to be the concept of least privilege, right? Give your users only the permissions they need to perform their daily duties. Do not err on the side of giving them too much permission.
So when it comes to organization, you actually have different kind of roles that are available to you. So an admin is always the person can control pretty much all settings and everything in an organization, and you can invite members to do certain things. Members are less privileged than admins, of course. They cannot see like the billing information, they cannot go and access the locked apps, they cannot go and take the app and transfer it out. They cannot like add new members, or basically they cannot do a lot of administrative features. Again, as Mikkel was saying, we should follow least privilege and only assign admins to the people that should be admins. So if you look at a quick comparison between what an admin and a member can do, there are certain things that just probably make sense only for admins to have like access to billing. In addition to that, there are also application roles.
Right, so exactly the same way under organizations you have an admin and you have a member. For applications, you can make a distinction between the application owner itself, which has full app permissions, right? And the 4 permissions for apps are view, deploy, operate, and manage. Obviously, all admins are owners. And then you have the role of collaborator. And a collaborator can be a person or a user that doesn't even belong to your enterprise. It's completely outside of your organization or your team, right? Somebody that might, I don't know, helping you code the application or helping you debug it or do some testing or something like that. So the distinction between owners and collaborators is done at an app level.
Right. So now let's say you have like your application set up and you have your members set up, and you would like to think, okay, we need to give members as little as possible, right? But they still need to be able to perform their daily duties. All of the 4 different types of permissions, there's a cheat sheet that Heroku documentation has at the bottom of the slide. You can see the pretty great matrix of covering what all the things a member could do with certain permissions, but everything starts with a view. The default permissions are just the view, and then you can add any subset of permissions. If you would like to add certain permission, you should follow least privilege, but we would like to cover the 2 permissions that actually give access to sensitive data.
Right, and those 2 permissions are deploy and operate. And where we are going with this is because of the way Heroku stores production secrets for your applications, right? And those could be credentials to access a database. It could be access tokens for some OAuth client application. It could be even a passphrase for some crypto scheme that you have coded, right? Those secrets are visible to admins, and we are emphasizing the need to follow least privilege and to provide only the permissions that are needed, because these deploy and operate permissions, they actually allow you to see the config vars, and the config vars is where the application secrets are currently stored.
Right, and so if some members, let's say, have different permissions, they can maybe go into an application and see if there's some production secrets. And to prevent this kind of behavior, there's actually a way to lock apps so that only the members who are added to specific apps can see the production secrets or can perform actions in those organizations. So admins can see all apps, including the locked ones, and the members, only the ones that were added, members of the organization, only the ones that were added to the org can perform actions in it.
Right, and in addition to protecting production secrets, right, you should be locking your apps just for consistency of the application, for change management purposes, to make sure that your production environment is stable.
Right, so no changes are made by accident. Now that we have talked about the organization, there's a new concept in Heroku that helps you organize developers working in teams for a better streamlined SDLC. Essentially, like Mikhail mentioned, organizations, they can be seen as a little flat. So you have orgs, so you have an organization that has developers and it has apps. And it's pretty much one view, there is no hierarchy in between. So how do you allow members to properly develop new apps, but at the same time not expose them to production secrets? And Heroku has a great way to do that is by organizing small development teams. Like, for example, take a big organization and a team may be working on some feature. So you create a team just for that feature. And the team is the admins and members and collaborators that are working together and producing an artifact. And this artifact later can then be deployed into production, which is an organization with a smaller set of admins.
Right, so this type of structure really helps you enforce role separation within an organization. You can ensure that your developers and testers have the capability of coding and testing the applications in a staging environment, and then you can leverage a very powerful tool in Heroku called pipelines to deploy these applications from the staging environment into production in such a way that the production environment is really controlled by a few highly trusted admins, and developers don't necessarily have access to that. They don't have access to the secrets there, they don't have access to stop or start applications, and you can maintain a stable environment that way.
Right, so to go over this again, teams are essentially a collaborative environment where you can have a number of developers working on features that they deliver, and they don't have to be exposed to production environment or related secrets, and they can be building blocks of your application.
Right, and from an economics point of view, right, you can have your teams running on a common runtime environment, and then have your production environment under private spaces, right? And you can use pipelines to move the applications from one environment to the other. So that would be a recommendation too.
Yeah. So now that we've taken a look at the roles and what permissions are associated with different roles, let's take a look at the logs and monitoring. So when you have your application running in production, the application itself is executing in a Dyno, and a Dyno is a small environment that it gets cycled every 24 hours. It's a small Linux container. What happens as a result is that you have to design your apps to be working in such ephemeral environment, and the logs that your application produces, they need to be also stored somewhere, right? So Heroku provides you a way to take a look at like the dynamics of the app. You can look at the throughput. You can see how many requests are hitting your application in the monitoring. But if you would like to actually look at the raw logs, you can Heroku gives you access to look at the logs. But what is the reason why logs are so important? A lot of people think, okay, the application is running, so what's the big deal? But logs may actually give you a hint at a compromised state. So there could be somebody exploiting your application, or you could be a victim of denial of service, or there could be some, let's say, unauthorized add-ons running in your application that you didn't know, and they have access to your production environment. So how do you take charge of the logs? Heroku gives you a way to either install a very powerful add-on, and you can choose the one that you like more, or the one that you have worked in the past. But you can also configure the logs to be sent over to your, let's say, Amazon S3 bucket. So you can take the logs using the Heroku tool belt, using the command line, and you say Heroku drains, and it will send the logs to your syslog server or to your HTTPS server.
Yeah, so I would say summarizing that aspect of the logs from a security point of view, right? I think Heroku makes it very easy for you to do it through add-ons, but it is your responsibility really to manage those logs properly, and the benefits are obvious from a forensics point of view and also from an incident response point of view. It's a good security move.
So we touched upon the topic of private spaces. So there's common runtime and there's private spaces in Heroku, and it's a recently new feature, so we'd like to give you a little bit more information about it.
Right. So I think private spaces is definitely one of the areas where there is more value add from a security point of view in Heroku, right? A private space is essentially an Amazon AWS VPC that has been provisioned for you by the Heroku team, and the provisioning process is somewhat transparent to the customers, but they follow some security best practices on hardening the VPC. And they provide some network isolation and certain whitelisting controls that really keep the data and the applications isolated from the rest of the internet.
Right, so if we're talking about the specific features that exposed to Heroku customers that use private spaces is things like dynamic ingress IP range whitelisting, so you can basically tell who is allowed from the outside of the internet to talk to your app. And if you're developing an app, it's really easy to say like, okay, this is my app and it talks to Heroku. And then when Heroku talks to you back, then you can say, okay, I know that Heroku private space that I have configured is only coming from these IP addresses. So I can, in my application, I can basically check that if it's coming from anywhere else to not trust it. In addition to that, let's say you can have add-ons that run in your private space, right? It could be a database or it could be a third-party kind of add-on. Those add-ons actually have access to your environment, and Heroku has a way to create a whitelist of the add-ons that are allowed in your organization.
Right. So a few thoughts on this. Make sure that for sensitive applications, right, the add-ons that you are whitelisting are talking to third parties on the internet over encrypted tunnels. That's one thing. And I wanted to talk about a potential use case in where this type of IP whitelistings come in very handy, right? Let's say that in your enterprise you have some sort of legacy application that you want to either integrate to some Heroku application or enhance it with a Heroku application. And this type of private space really allows you to configure your firewalls to make sure that the legacy application is only talking to that Heroku instance. You can go even farther by doing some certificate pinning and ensuring that the communications are over TLS.
Right. So as we managed before, the private space provides the private dynos. So these private dynos, there are not being shared with the common runtime. You actually, as a customer, you get your own private space, and when you create another private space, they are also not collocated. So they're all getting separate hardware, which helps a lot with performance hiccups and protects you from so-known collocation attacks, where like virtual machines that running on the same hardware is attacking virtual machines from another customer that's running on the same hardware. Private spaces are completely taking care of that. And so once you have set it up, you can set up a TLS, you can set up the certificate, and you're good to go.
Yeah, that's one thing about private spaces, is that you need to provide the TLS certificate. That's not something that Heroku will do for you.
Right.
Yep.
So as we mentioned before, what a dyno is, it's basically a lightweight Linux container. The dyno, one dyno is running one process. And so what it means that you can actually easily scale your application that runs on Heroku by having a number of dynos. But what Heroku is also doing for you is when the dynos are getting cycled, they're coming back with all of the patches, all of the security updates, all of the latest kernel, and you basically get the benefits of Heroku and all of the research community getting you the latest, safest environment to run your applications in.
Right, and as we saw in the earlier slide, right, dynos can run in the common runtime environment in Heroku, which means that they can be accessible from pretty much anywhere on the internet. But when you're using private spaces, the dynos that are spun up for you are within the isolated network. So they will be accessible according to your IP restrictions that you have set up.
Right. So we touched upon the topic of add-ons and whitelisting, and there are certain add-ons that actually Heroku provides itself. So like Postgres and Reddit, the new versions that Heroku has developed specifically for the private spaces, there are not running in common runtime. They're running actually in a private space, in your private space. So what it means is effectively, if before you could take the credentials to the Postgres database, for example, and you could go from like public internet and talk to it. So you could talk to your app, or you could talk to the Postgres database. With private spaces, because the database is sitting inside the private space, you cannot actually go around and talk to the database directly. You have to talk to the private space first, so that you can talk to the database.
Right, so that's the main distinction here, right? Regular Postgres database is accessible from anywhere in the internet, and the only security control that you have in there is the credential to access that database and the rotation policy that you have. With private spaces, the database is within the isolated network, so besides the credentials to get into the database, you need to come from the right IP and so forth. It can be managed, the database can be managed only through Heroku command line interface. And because it is on the private space, it comes with, I think it is for premium and enterprise tiers, it comes with full encryption.
Okay, so with that, we would like to summarize what we have talked so far. In the beginning, we talked about enabling two-factor authentication, and in order to enable enterprise policies, you can use SSO.
Right. We also talked about how you should be organizing your enterprise and your processes and your groups to leverage Heroku teams, in where you have groups of developers focusing on specific applications. You have private spaces to isolate your network in production, so it can be accessed from specific IPs. And you can use your organization roles to align the access level of your employees to least privilege and need to do. So make sure that your developers have access to in your team to the applications, but they don't necessarily have access to production. They don't have access to production secrets. They cannot deploy applications into production without following proper change management.
We also talked about IP whitelisting and add-on whitelisting in order to limit who can access your application and data. Essentially, this allows you to control the environment and control the integrations between your enterprise environment and Heroku.
And since it's not a good idea to keep secrets in groups of 40, we recommend that you keep the number of admins in your production environment to no more than 3 highly trusted individuals. That will ensure that those production secrets don't basically get socialized throughout the organization.
And once you get to a point where your application is production ready, then we recommend that you lock the application so that no changes can be made by outsiders in the organization, and you start monitoring the apps so that you make sure you can detect any unauthorized changes, or you can see that the app is actually doing what it's supposed to do. We have some resources that we quoted at the bottom of the slides. They're courtesy of Heroku awesome documentation. There's a lot of good cheat sheets that you can go take a look. And with that, we would like to thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
There are actually some talks that will be happening by our colleagues tomorrow and Friday. So on Thursday, there are sessions about Lightning by Ryan and Harmast and about common security mistakes. And on Friday, we have also sessions about Force.com scanner and more details about 2FA and why you should use it.
Yeah, so we recommend that you attend the 2FA talk because that's one of the recommendations, the main ones that we were giving out today.
Thank you.
So, time for questions.
Yeah, so you mentioned that if you're in a private space, that you should make sure that the add-ons are speaking to your encryption tunnels, and then you talked about those add-ons that are provided by Heroku that would reside in a private space. How are customers supposed to find those add-ons that talk to encryption channels?
It's Heroku.
The add-ons are listed differently on our add-ons marketplace, and anyone going through private spaces is also going to have an AE who'd be able to help you out. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Regarding the fact that Dyno recycle every 24 hours, I know it's kind of random there. What if you have a job somewhere not running? What's the recommendation of best practice around that? How do we handle the recycle while on the optimized?
So you mean a job that lasts more than 24 hours or something that could get interrupted?
It was running at the time that, is there an event or something like that?
It should be seamless as far as your user experience. Like there should be no downtime associated with it.
You don't need to.
I'm talking about some back-end job, so instead of processing something, it might not be a job.
Right, so what we're saying is not going to get interrupted.
Right.
You should not be worried about that, and we're just giving you a little bit more detail about how Dynos are implemented.
Right.
So it's roughly 24 hours. But
I mean, the recommendation is if you need to persist data, which is not necessarily a process that's running, right, then you use Postgres or Redis or
Right.
data storage. But for a process, you should be okay.
yeah, so yeah.
You say that in private spaces, the Dyno are materialized but isolated on the magical side. Like it means that if I only have like a few Dynos, they will run on a different machine, or do you still split them on different machines? How does it work? Like, I mean, it's transparent for us, but on a security point of view, like, is it different machines, or how is it? Or it's only virtual machines but are isolated through VPC? through a virtual network?
So there, it depends whether you are talking about like pairing two spaces or having multiple apps within a space. You can have multiple of your own apps inside of one private space, and you can also pair with another private space that you control.
Yeah, even if I'm having only one space and one app into one space, I'm putting I don't know, Dyno there.
Yeah, that's it. You're single tenant if you're private spaces, so that no one else's stuff would be on there.
Yeah.
Okay, and it
No.
will be physical machines that will run all by Dyno, so dedicated machines, basically, or not.
You know, I honestly don't know if it's different physical machines or just like distinct virtual machines.
Okay,
Right.
that was my question, because I know that sometimes a Heroku can have trouble between Dynos, and I wanted to know like if having a virtual private space would protect me from having other, I would say, noisy neighbors.
Yeah, I mean that's
Private space is designed for that.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, it has been designed for that.
Yes.
Yes.
Here it's right that if you are in private spaces, the only way to access the Postgres database is going to be through a command line.
Yes.
You cannot have some kind of UI to do that if you are also adding it, or how?
Yeah. So the Postgres database is basically sitting in your private space, so you can't talk to it from the outside. And the only way to talk to it is through the command line. There's no UI per se that you can use to talk to it, but there's APIs that you can quickly write queries to look at the data.
So if you were using a Postgres client before, right?
Yeah,
to talk,
exactly.
yeah, that would not work.
Is there any way to connect to a private space, like directly open a, I don't know, a VPN connection or something like this to get in the virtual space?
And then use some kind of UI.
So I guess it could be something that Heroku could consider for the roadmap.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation we're having, but at the moment, no.
Any more questions? Looks like people are ready to go to YouTube and listen to Bono instead of me or us.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.